Hello, friends. Greetings from Rome, the eternal city. A warm welcome to the webinar Integrated Management of Historic Cities, Challenges and Opportunities, organized as part of ICCROM Lecture Series. First of all, let me introduce myself, Rohit Jigyasu, Project Manager at ICCROM, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. ICCROM, the intergovernmental organization, as part of its mission to support the conservation of all forms of cultural heritage in every region of the world, organizes the series to present and discuss various issues, ideas, and initiatives by inviting professionals and civic society representatives from various disciplinary backgrounds. So I will just share the screen now. Historic cities are rich cultural resources that have evolved over time through sustained relationship to their territory and social fabric that have been source of tangible and intangible heritage and traditional knowledge systems connecting people, culture, and nature. Louis Mumford, renowned urbanist, in his essay, What is a City, written in 1938, had famously said, the city as one finds in its history the maximum concentration for power and culture of a community. In many traditional sources and many religions, the human body itself is often compared to a city with all its social and political functions. Another important philosophical point discussed in many traditions is that historic cities are not just physical conglomerations that were built as an ensemble, they are also a reflection of celestial or modeled reality of the spiritual world. So when we strive to protect, while we strive to protect all the attributes of the city that contribute to its significance, we have to be mindful of the fact that historic cities are living and dynamic entities in an ever-changing, complex relationship with their geographical, social, and economic context, and therefore freezing them for posterity might not be a desirable and even feasible option. So we are passing through a great urban upsurge with increasing number of people migrating to cities in search of jobs, especially in the developing world, posing threat to urban heritage while also increasing the vulnerability and risks to people, property, and economy to natural hazards, including those triggered by climate change. So, in fact, there are many development pressures, uncontrolled tourism, and also disasters and conflicts that have made historic cities vulnerable than ever before. So, management of historic cities calls for a delicate balance between the needs of protecting urban heritage and achieving sustainable urban development. However, the challenges facing in our century really calls for not to stop heritage protection in the border within heritage conservation, but go beyond it and link with other specializations in different sectors. And there for coordination and integration is really an important element in management of historic cities. We need to definitely find ways for mainstreaming heritage in urban planning and development, and rather than focusing mainly on the preservation of historic fabric by taking into consideration projections of urban growth, social, economic, and environmental changes. The webinar aims to bring forward key considerations for such an approach and lessons learned from good practices in urban planning and management. In this webinar, we are indeed privileged to be joined by a multidisciplinary group of professionals from heritage conservation and urban planning and development fields. We'll have the two keynote presentations followed by four case studies from Chile, Tanzania, India, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. May I now request the speakers to turn on their cameras as I introduce them. Please come. So it is indeed an honor for me, and you can see he's right next to me, renowned heritage expert, Dr. Yuka Yukileto, is special advisor to the Director General of ICCROM and former ICOMOS advisor for World Heritage. There would be hardly any heritage professional or a student of conservation who would not have heard of Yuka, who has also authored numerous scientific papers and publications on history and theory of conservation. So thank you very much, Yuka. I'm also very delighted to welcome our second keynote speaker, Mr. Dr. Aroma Revi, founding member and director of Indian Institute for Human Settlements, IIHS. Over a decade, Aro has built IIHS into one of world's leading education, research, training, advisory, and implementation support institution, focusing on multi-dimensional challenges and opportunities for sustainable urbanization. In fact, I myself had the privilege of working with IIHS during the initial years of its inception. And now I am also pleased to introduce our panelists, Ms. Maria Andrea Margota from National Center for World Heritage Sites in Chile. Because of the time difference, Maria has shared her video with us, but she would not be there with us in person. Also, Mr. Mohammed Juma, if you can also turn on your camera. He's currently in charge of Africa Desk at World Heritage Center at UNESCO. Mr. S. Vishwanath from Biome Environmental Solutions based in Bangalore, India, and Professor Marcus Schweif from Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Trondheim. So before I proceed further, may I apprise you of some procedures for housekeeping during the webinar. You can send your queries and comments via Q&A icon that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will take up some questions after the presentations by our panelists. In case we are unable to answer all the questions due to the shortage of time, please send us an email and we'll surely get back to you. So let me have this privilege of firstly inviting Dr. Yuka Yukileto, who will be presenting his perspective on planning for historic territories. So let's listen to Yuka.
My talk is about planning in historic territories. Next slide. I will start with the Venice Charter because that is the point where the second half of the 19th century, the 20th century, actually developed the tech methodologies which are now relevant for the conservation of historic urban areas. It is interesting to notice the way the historic monument was defined in 1964 in the UNESCO meeting in Venice. In the French version, it was said that the historic monument is a single architectural creation, which can be either a single building or an urban or rural site. The English version instead talks about the historic single architectural work with its urban or rural setting. And I think that is an interesting change because now we are going from the monument to the historic urban area. Next. In 2005, which is about 50 years later, UNESCO has adopted the Convention of Cultural Expressions, Protection and Promotion of Cultural Expressions, which now combines the tangible and intangible aspects. We can notice that anything that the human beings are producing always can have a material basis, but it always has also the meaning or the significance which is intangible, which is associated with it. Next. In World War II, many historic urban areas were damaged badly or destroyed. But even though this was a big disaster, it also promoted a much greater awareness of heritage that were the familiar places that were lost by the people. And so there was a process of reconstruction of war-damaged historic cities. In the picture we have Dresden, which was very badly damaged right at the end of the war. And then the purpose of reconstruction was to maintain the low profile in the center, so as to allow for the historic buildings to be visible in this new context. Next slide. There were also various national initiatives, particularly in the 1960s. In UNESCO, in UK, we have the establishment of a conservation area concept, which defined specific urban areas as conservation area, within which you had buildings which were listed for protection and other buildings which were considered a group value and therefore also to be preserved. In France, we had the sector Sauvegarde, which had also its own plan, and they were aiming at the mise en valeur, that is the valorization of these areas, which were usually very strongly architectural. In Italy, we have the Centro Storico, which is a historic center, which became a very important concept in the Italian urban conservation planning, based especially in the 1960s on the Carta di Gubbio, the Charter of Gubbio for urban conservation. Here, the urban conservation was fundamentally understood as a municipal activity, and where the people and the population were supposed to participate. While in France, it was a government activity, and in UK, it was a sort of joint activity between the national government, local government, and the people. Next slide. One of the requirements of inscription to the World Heritage List is the condition of integrity. It is interesting that the condition of integrity has been defined as so that the property needs to include all the elements that contribute to its significance. So we have here again the fact that the significance is the intangible aspect which needs to be taken into account even when they are dealing with historic urban areas. So, for example, in the case of Dubrovnik, which is in the picture, we can say that the fortified city was the medieval fortified city, planned fortified city, which was first inscribed in the World Heritage List in 1979. But then in 2018, also the surrounding later urban area with a mountain in the background were added because they were considered to contribute to the significance of the site, but also from the management point of view, essential in order to guarantee the proper development of traffic, infrastructure, planning, tourism here in this particular case. Next. Authenticity is another aspect which can be seen that we are talking about not only material authenticity, we are also talking about immaterial authenticity. And I think that this is a major problem sometimes when we are dealing with the World Heritage concept and the intangible cultural heritage, which is the 2003 convention. But actually, authenticity is a fundamental aspect of heritage. If it is not authentic, it is not heritage. Next slide. Integrated urban conservation planning then started developing, especially from the 1970s. In 1975, which was the European Architectural Heritage Year, there was a declaration of Amsterdam, which came out from the concluding meeting, which defined the architectural heritage, which include also not only the individual buildings of exceptional quality, but also the surroundings and the areas, villages, which had some cultural and historic interest. Next. The historic areas as a totality were the topic of the UNESCO 1976 recommendation, where they said that every historic area and its surroundings should be considered in their totality as a coherent whole. So you have to discuss the whole city when we are dealing with conservation, because the conservation area is part of the whole city. All validating elements, including human activities, however modest, thus have a significance in relation to the whole, which must not be disregarded. Next. Therefore, in fact, the cultural landscape is like a broadening. Still, you are not only dealing with historic urban areas, you're also talking about landscapes, such as the Dresden Elbe Valley, which was once inscribed in the World Heritage List in the 1990s. Next. In order to understand what is the territory and what should be maintained and preserved and conserved, it is necessary to identify the functional typologies of the buildings and spaces of which this sort of areas consist. So you have the residential areas, you have commercial areas, you have administrative places, and so on. And what is interesting here is that the significance which is giving the reason for conserving in urban conservation is fundamentally an intangible aspect of the heritage, not so much the architectural quality. The architectural quality is, of course, also important, but it is like a second level of activity. Then you need to understand how well the architectural integrity, the structural integrity of the various buildings and elements is preserved. Are they integrally preserved or partly preserved? And then you decide the conservation treatment and the appropriate use. In fact, generally speaking, we can say that when we are dealing with traditional urban areas, very often the residential use is my priority and priority use. But of course, you also need to have the services and the other supporting issues. Next. Historic urban layers are also part of the historic areas. The city like Bologna in Italy was actually originally like a Roman city, which was then surrounded by a medieval fabric later, and then became a modern city. So, in fact, it's interesting that the Roman streets are still there, so that when we are looking at the historic urban area, it's also necessary to look at the whole stratigraphy, the historical stratigraphy on site inspection, but also perhaps in archival research. Next. Historic urban landscape is the latest type of management instrument which was adopted, which was recommended by UNESCO in the 2011 international recommendation. So the historic urban landscape approach aims at preserving the quality of the human environment, enhancing the productive and sustainable use of urban spaces while recognizing their dynamic character and promoting social and functional diversity. But of course, it means that we need to involve the population. We need to instruct the population. There must be capacity building, which is a fundamental issue. It's also interesting that historic urban landscape is not only focusing on the protected areas, but also especially for the surroundings, because it is the surroundings which often have the negative impacts that undermine the significance of historic areas. Next. This 2011 recommendation proposes specific types of tools which involve civic engagement, knowledge and planning, but also especially also traffic and infrastructure, which are often very important, particularly when we are dealing with traditional historic cities like the Kerman in Iran. But particularly it is important to involve the capacity building processes and research in order to understand and to inform and communicate what is the scope of this conservation activity. And then we have to have the finances. Next. It is interesting to notice that we have three types of landscapes in the various international recommendations. One is the landscape as a scenery, a natural landscape. Cultural landscape is the historical territory, which is particularly an archaeological aspect of the landscape. And then you have the historical landscape, which is a management framework. So if we look, for example, at the Assisi in the picture here, we can say that if we only look at it as a landscape, as a scenery, then we have one type of management. If we are talking about it as a historical territory, then we have another type of management, because then we need to go much further down into the various stratigraphies. And if it is a question about historical and landscape, then it is a question about management framework. Next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuka, for your very, very fascinating historical overview on urban heritage and integrated conservation planning through consideration of territorial approach. Now, Yuka is going to be with me here as we do this webinar. So after the presentations, if you have questions for Yuka, he's there to answer you. So please do write to us if you have any specific questions for him. Now, I also want to make one announcement, like some of you have been raising hands, please do not do so. Just send your points in the Q&A box. The next presenter, and I'm pleased to invite Dr. Aroma Revi. He will be speaking on sustainable urban development and explaining it in the light of pressing challenges. So Aroma, over to you.
Thanks, Rohit. I'll try and be quick and also be provocative if you kind of encourage me to. So in some senses, I guess the core question is, why is sustainable urbanization important? We've seen some wonderful examples, starting with that initial introduction from Manfred, and then Yuka showed us some wonderful examples of how to work this through. But the world is in a very sort of dramatic context at the current point of time. It's more than half urban. It's going to become 2/3 urban in the next couple of decades or so. So cities in some ways have become so successful that, starting from a humble beginning, and I'm just going back to just after the war, population of 0.75 billion in large urban centers, an economic size of 3 trillion, and then they grew and grew to 2010, a population of 2.9 billion, and you can see the growth of sort of urbanization across the world. But most important, apart from the growth of population, is the sort of increase in economic size from 3 million to about 30 trillion. And I think that's something that we really have to take into account when we're looking at historic cities, because they're not only places in which people live, where we're preserving human culture, tangible or intangible, but also they're places which are key economic drivers. And they become so aspirational, and I guess you can see this is an image of Singapore. You can see the sort of inner precinct just now, which is in their context, I would say historic. But they have now proceeded to, in effect, within quotes, conquer the planet. And this is our projections for 2030 from UNDESA, a population of 5 billion plus in urban areas, and an economic size of 90 trillion. So I think one needs to look at both those aspects when we're looking at this. So this is global urbanism in some senses, very much in kind of a changing geography, especially in Asia and Africa and Latin America, apart from traditional sites in Europe and in North America. But of course, there are some nasty unintended consequences. And in places that many of us live in, let's say for India and in China, you have this kind of a challenge that comes from that form of urbanization. It not only impacts, the sort of tangible culture. The Taj Mahal is under serious impact because of SO2 pollution, but you can see this as a global human impact of cities and urbanization and all the stuff that we put out just into the atmosphere from satellites. So, if you look at it also in the context of a most important challenge we're facing, I would say existential challenge we're facing across the world of climate change, we talk of climate and we talk of stranded assets, which may in some senses become historic in some ways, like coal-fired power plants, if we are able to make the renewables transition. But in actual fact, and I think this is an important question to think about, and I think cities like Venice actually faces in very existentialist ways is that our real standard assets in some senses, as the global environment, especially local environments, are changing, are our cities. And I think we're probably not spending enough time thinking about this. I'm in the middle of writing a sort of a lead IPCC chapter on this question, and I can tell you there are large numbers of places across the world that are deeply challenged, and we'll see that actually playing itself out over the middle and the latter part of the century. Yet, as you guys just showed us, urban areas can be remarkably resilient. They can go from this, Tokyo in 1945 after the firebombing, to this. And I think the question then is, how does one try and integrate elements that have actually been both destroyed and come back in that sort of understanding of what's happening? So I guess the core question I'm trying to sort of lay out, the core provocation in a sense, is what is a historic city in the context of planetary urbanism and urban transformation? And, a wonderful image here, this is Shanghai, the Bund looking across at Pudong. So, of course, this is a historic district. But if you look at it in time, this is 1987, this is something that's much more contemporary. I guess the core question is, what is this new historic kind of district going to look like? How do we deal with both these elements? Because there is such dramatic changes happening in many parts of the world. How does one preemptively deal with this as hundreds of millions of people actually come into in urban areas? The other question that one has is, what are the other dimensions of urbanization that we need to address to enable integrated urban management? I think in this, because the bulk of the sort of incipient urbanization is going to come in the global south, we have to recognize particular characteristics of cities. So, the question in some senses, if you look at a typical city of the global south, where informality is the central element, is this historic? Is this something that one would want to remember and preserve? Because cities are places of opportunity. They're also places of enterprise and hope among poverty. This is, in some ways, this is from South Asia, intangible heritage. It's kind of, it's not as clean and nice as it is in other parts of the world. There are also places of productivity amongst deep inequality. You can sort of probably recognize this image from Rio. So question is, if one has to remember the kind of inequality that we've seen in the late 20th and sort of early 21st century, is this something that we want to engage with and preserve? Or is it only the places of the more privileged or the rich that we're going to try to deal with? Because, cities are actually places of contest. And this is, of course, from Cairo, about, almost a decade ago. And they're contests for a better life and a better world. So if that is part of intangible culture, how does one sort of maintain a memory of these changes and these transformations? Is it only in the built fabric? Is it also in other elements of it? And I guess the core question, and I guess you recognize this, is, are these places in which sustainable development and climate transformation can be enabled, and how does one sort of integrate those things? Because this is what's actually happening in the world today, and this is how things are going to actually transform themselves. So the question I'm trying to address very quickly just now is, why is urban sustainability and climate action important to the integrated management of historic cities? Because in some ways, this is the reality of what we're going to be dealing with. So I had the opportunity between 2013 and 15 to help negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals. This is where it was finally sealed in September 2015, just about 5 years ago. And of course, one of the most interesting challenges we had was to integrate the protection of heritage as an integral part of SDG 11, which is the so-called SDG as far as cities is concerned. And there were interesting twists and turns that maybe we can talk about later. But one of the core questions is, how do you want to integrate that into the development framework of countries and, of course, the world? And how do you actually measure this? And I think we had a deep discussion with UNESCO on this question. And, it wasn't easy, let's say. So this is the Sustainable Development Goal framework. Some of you may be sort of quite aware of it, but I'll quickly sort of lay it out. This is what all countries in the world, or 193 member states, have kind of agreed on. It's a universal agenda, so it's for all people everywhere. So in some senses, it embraces the kind of universalism and depth that you're trying to deal with in conservation, in the management of historic cities. Of course, there's a strong focus on SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities, but actually, for cities to be sustainable, for us to be able to actually protect our heritage and culture effectively, we have to, in some ways, sweep across the SDGs. Because in a historic center of a city, for example, if you have poverty, if you have hunger, if you have poor health, if you have lack of quality of education, then you can imagine what life would be there and what impact it would have even on the sort of tangible heritage in some senses. So this framework, in a sense, provides us something which gives us a very concrete way of trying to address holistically how development would take place, whether it's a historic center or one that will become historic over the century as urbanization spreads across the world. So it's the integration of all these goals and the localization, as we call it, that's kind of very critical. They've been set as a universal agenda, but actually, making this tangible at the local level is actually quite critical. There's one important thing that people don't necessarily understand or know about the goal, and that is there was a very important commitment that was made by national governments. The first one, of course, is to deal with equity and justice, and that is to leave no one behind. But there's something that we actually wrote into Goal 11, which ties in with the cultural heritage element, and that is to leave no place behind. And I think this is something that we haven't actually used adequately for historic places, because that's how you sort of integrate that into the sort of national sort of settlement system and the fabric we're talking about. And finally, we just heard about landscapes. Cities are dependent on ecosystems and ecosystem services. To sort of linking the two together is actually very critical. So this is how it sort of breaks itself down. There's SDG 11 up on the left-hand side there on sustainable cities and communities. And of course, we have 7 targets. Now, the reason I focused on this is because target 11.4 is one of the few places in the Sustainable Development Goal framework in which you have a clear commitment to protect cultural and natural heritage. But in some senses, my question to you is, how can you do that without addressing all the other targets simultaneously about safe and affordable housing, about affordable and sustainable transport systems, which don't actually damage the environment and impact the people there, to make urbanization inclusive, to reduce the adverse effect of natural disasters. And, Rohit has mentioned this earlier, and we've seen the impact of that on cultural heritage across the world. And of course, reduce the environmental impact of cities, because cities and natural areas around that, the ecosystems, are tied to each other. And of course, providing access to public spaces, which in a sense is what high quality conservation actually gives us in some ways. So added to this is the challenge of the imperatives that came to us when we were able to negotiate and close the Paris Climate Agreement. So I guess I'll close with some very simple ideas here about how you can bring the ideas of sustainable development and climate action together. And the way that we articulate it, at least in the climate spaces, it's around 4 key system transitions. The central one, of course, is the energy transition, because if you don't actually move from fossil fuels to sort of renewable energy, we're all in deep trouble. But pivotal to that in the world today is the transition that we call the urban and the infrastructural transition. We saw that image of the Roman street, and that's a critical infrastructure on which Roman heritage and what we find of it is actually sort of tied together. There's similar kind of questions that would come up in some senses as we have the first freeways in some parts of the world. Do you keep them or let them go 100 years later, etc.? So these are the 4 key system transitions. I'll just sort of lay them out to give you some images of how they look. The critical one, of course, is the energy and the industrial transition. So especially as the industrial revolution is now 150 years or more old, how does one actually capture elements of that and maintain that? And of course, very interesting sort of image here, which brings together particular SDGs. And this is from Copenhagen, which is one of the sort of clean, green manufacturing centers in the world. And you can see elements of historic fabric, which is sort of pre-industrial. You see the industrial fabric also, and the so-called post-industrial green wind turbines that you can see in the background. So this is all coming together in sort of a new form of urbanism that's emerging in many parts of the world that embraces all of these questions simultaneously. The critical one, of course, as far as natural heritage is concerned, is the land and ecosystem transition. This is an image from Vancouver. So how do you secure regional food systems and sustainable agriculture, the thing that actually makes cities like Vancouver and other cities across the world much more sustainable and resilient to shock, not only because of climate, but also a whole range of other questions we are seeing, especially during and after COVID, or as these new forms of urbanism, which are much more sustainable, work themselves out. How does one integrate this? And this is from an image from Zero Energy Development in London, both in retrofit and otherwise. How does one bring about this kind of sort of engagement in some senses? And then finally, the core transition around urban and infrastructure, of which one must not forget, people are at the center of this. And I think one of the central challenges of the Urban Sustainable Development Goals is actually to create 600 million new productive jobs by 2030. And, we have less than 10 years to do this. And this year, in some senses, is a lost year with COVID. How does one provide sustainable water supply and access to environmental services, not only from areas like this you see in Bangkok, but also other areas that may be seen as historic conservation districts. And of course, the deep conflicts and challenges of sustainable transportation, this iconic image from Perth, which looks at, high-speed and commuter rail in some senses, and the motor car, which actually may become, a historic artifact, at least as far as people in sustainability are concerned, in maybe a decade or two's time. So how do you actually sort of bring together and hold that together? And finally, of course, housing. And this is a example from Hong Kong, which kind of is archetypical and an archetypal image of what we may have to conserve and deal with in the center of Hong Kong. Things that were built there in the 1960s, which are absolutely critical to addressing, about 1.5 billion people living in slums. That how does one try and integrate that into integrated urban management? So thank you very much. I'll stop there and stop my screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Aro. I think you really brought forward all the challenges that we are facing, especially our cities that are really, going through an immense transformation. You also helped us understand the challenges, but also how you elaborated on various dimensions of urbanization that we need to address in order to enable integrated urban management. So please do stay up with us. Maybe we have questions for you at the end of the presentations. Now, after stimulating presentations by keynote speakers, let us turn to the case studies that are being presented by our panelists. And first, let's listen to the case of the revival of historical elevators in the World Heritage City of Valparaíso in Chile. And the presentation is made by Ms. Maria Andrea Margota. So let's listen to Maria.
So, Valparaíso is a seaport city located on the coast of central Chile. It's the capital of the region of Valparaíso. The historic area of the seaport city of Valparaíso was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2003 under the Criteria 3. The area inscribed on the World Heritage List corresponds to the historical area of the city. Here you can see the boundaries of the site and its buffer zone in red. Valparaíso's outstanding universal value, it is based on the fact that the area is an exceptional testimony of the early phase of globalization on the late 19th century, when it became the leading commercial port on the sea routes of the Pacific coast of South America. From its integrity point of view, within the boundaries of the property are located all the elements necessary to express the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage Site. One of the main attributes of this living city are its historical elevators that will be the focus of this presentation. The elevators are located along the amphitheater shape of the city. 16 of them are currently listed as national monuments, recognizing its origin in the need to ensure communication between the different areas of the city. The topography forced great efforts to communicate the elevated neighborhoods with the commercial and civic sector of the port. 3 of these elevators are located within the World Heritage Site and some others in the buffer zone. This transport system is to these days essential for the urban operation of the city. The older elevators were built in the last decades of the 19th century and most of them on the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The elevator consists of 2 wooden or metal cabins which move in an opposite direction. The rails are placed on the slope according to the topography of the hills. For traction, a steel cable displaced with electrical energy is used. the system has been modernized over time. They have a station at the top and in the plan of the city. Most of these lower stations are located in residual space between buildings. The higher stations are true observation towers with a simple architecture. The main value of these elevators is being an optimal solution to a transport problem in an exceptional topographic environment. The elevators of Valparaíso have also been a source of inspiration to artists. Here you can see a work of art by Lucas, a Chilean-Italian artist illustrating the experience of an elevator's ride. Concern related to the state of conservation of the elevators and the challenges for their recovery are long-standing. However, obtaining resources and solving technical and administrative issues have made possible in recent years. One of the main objectives of this intervention is to integrate this transport into the public system, which require updating of this electromechanical system for its operation under current modern standards. Some elevators were privately owned, so a first step was the acquisition with public funds allocated from the local government. Then a program was developed by the Heritage Department of the Ministry of Public Works considering the recovery of 9 elevators. Intervention guidelines were prepared by the National Monuments Council, which mainly considered to ensure the continuity of their function. A greater degree of intervention will be allowed in the rolling plane, and for the station, these guidelines considered the preservation of their historical presence in the world urban context. The project designs considered an exhaustive diagnosis survey of each component, as the rolling plane, the station, and the elements of the electromechanical system, which served as the basis for the recovery proposals. In the design stage, some meetings with the community were considered. I will focus in the first group of 3 elevators, Espíritu Santo, Cordillera, y Concepción. That was the first group to start construction works. The recovery works of the first elevators began at the end of 2016, starting a long-standing dream for the inhabitants of Valparaíso. The beginning of the works meant their closing and the impossibility of using this important transport by the community for 2 years approximately. In this photograph, you can see some details from the construction work process. In some of the elevators, as the Cordillera and Espíritu Santo, archaeological remains were found, those related to old structures or materials from the older stations. Here it's possible to appreciate some photographies of the elevators and the recovery station located in the World Heritage Site or its surroundings. Here's the ascensor Concepción y Cordillera y el ascensor Espíritu Santo. As opportunities, I would like to highlight the efforts made by provide continuity to the function that these valuable elements deliver to the city of Valparaíso and to its community, contributing to the integrity of the World Heritage Site. On the other hand, there are some challenges that still need to be addressed. One is to implement a management model to ensure this intervention will be sustainable over time. Then to overcome technical difficulties or conflict points between modernization and conservation. And 3, to promote the recognition of the elevator operator as part of this living heritage. Finally, I will share with you some videos of the elevators. So, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation that demonstrates how heritage attributes like elevators can be integrated with contemporary infrastructure needs of the city through collaborative efforts. Our next panelist is Mr. Muhammad Juma, who will be presenting the case of integration of heritage concerns in urban planning for Zanzibar World Heritage in Tanzania. So floor is yours, Muhammad.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my video now.
Yes, it is perfect. Please, you can start your slides.
Okay, thank you. I thank you very much, and good afternoon, friends and colleagues. I just wanted to show you an example of kind of challenge which has been highlighted by Yuka and Dr. Amu, how this historical city is sometimes faced with challenge. But maybe also my presentation will be kind of inspiration, and that is maybe an attempt to answer the question of Amu, how do you do, Amor, Aramo, how do you do, how can you preserve this historical city in this context of urban development? And I think what we do most in historical cities is maybe to give inspiration, and how can others be inspired when in this process of movement towards sustainable development. So I'll show the case of Zanzibar, where we had faced this problem of challenge of linkage between historical city and urban ensemble. And here I will talk later on the idea of a whole approach, which Yuka has explained, and how that challenge started and how we have solved. So my presentation will go in 3 points, just to show somehow the historical process of creation this urban conservation, which Yuka, she showed us those steps toward the urban area, urban conservation and sector safeguarding, how we have done it, and what were the challenge later on following that. And that way I wanted to show the idea of urban planning is very, very important when we're going to this management of historical city. And what have we done as in Zanzibar to face those challenges? And this maybe can be inspiration and attempt to answer. So for some of you who doesn't know where we are talking about and place, I'm going to talk about this small island in East Africa, Zanzibar, which is part of this what we call Indian Ocean Rim, and it has been very important port during 18th and 19th century. And then of course, Zanzibar was a capital of that, and this is some architectural influence where you can see from the left is one of the beautiful, crafts, and inspiration from the, heritage from inspiration from India. On the left, you can see one of the churches, Anglican church in the island. Here also some example of, social influences, Baraza in the left, where small altar where local people, they're sitting in the evening, and how do we use these spaces? This is part of the resilience where Aramo showed in one of the streets in Japan. This is one example where historical city, they really offer these kind of things. But also, we have a special influence in how cities are, fabricated, and you can see here the fabric of the city. So where do we start? I have this small sketch on the left of 1846, 150 years old. You can see in the left-hand side, we have a stone town, which is started to become grow. On the right-hand side, you have an area called Ngambo. It's like, the other side. On the middle, you have a creek. So this was like very important pattern of the historical city of Zanzibar. Left-hand side, you have a historical city, which is started to grow. You have a creek, which divide between the old part and the new part, which is going to develop more and more. And here you have a photo for, plan of 1892. You can see that the other part of the city is starting to be bigger, more bigger than the historical part, of course the historical part is developing. We have now a map of the first master plan of Zanzibar, 1923. There was an attempt, to remove this creek and create a continuation from the historical party, the other part. And remember, there was a creek before. So 1923, there was a decision just to reclaim it, and they reclaimed it, and there was a kind of nice garden was created there, and they created continuity, because for them it was impossible that historical city has to isolate itself from the other large ensemble. And that in 1992, you can see that the master plan of 1992, that creek is not there. That continuity is already done. If you look at this map of 1982, if someone tell you that there was a creek here, you cannot believe it, because it's just historical city and then continuity. And that was a plan of 1982. But for some reasons, of historical city, economical, social, we started to have a problem in historical city. In 1985, the government of Zanzibar, a part of Tanzania, took a decision to create a special organization for managing this historical city. And then in 1994, we created our first master plan. So here now we enter in the conservation process, urban conservation process. So when we do this master plan on urban conservation, we did something somehow strange, but that was the philosophy of that time. We say, look, we have this, as you can say, historical party, sector safeguarded. Let's preserve this, and the rest, let's leave the rest on its own. So here, this red line, you can say, is really boundary. So in a way, we have created again that idea of isolation between historical city and the other part. But this time, with idea, we didn't create it physically, with idea of conservation. And here it was about conservation. So conservation part was really concentrating in historical city. The other part of the city was not part of conservation process. And in their management process, even the administration was, as I told you, in 1985, we have another organization dealing with conservation city and municipality dealing with the other. And then 2000, the Stone Town of Zanzibar was granted, status of World Heritage City. So, and this status was coming to endorse, the master plan of conservation master plan. So now you have historical city, you have buffer zone, you have a number with the other party. So this is exactly exclusion somehow, but in a mental, not physical as such. And here we start to have a problem. Because if you look at this map now, look, that's Stone Town, and look in the middle you have a number, and look the other enlarged ensemble. And most of the population of this inhabitant of this large part, they use their service in historical city. I've shown you in the map in the left-hand side, you have port, you have gardens, you have commercial area, tourism area, hospital, market. They were all in historical city. So how do you, if you just isolate this two part, how can you manage it? And here where the role of, urban planning is very, very important. And we started to see the crisis, a challenge, and one of it, and this is just to show an example, how all the city, that large part of the city was very much depending on the historical party for their life. I can see here in the beach, you have garden and sort of area, as I told you, the market area, you have the, port area, they were all part of it. One of the very important critical problem which happened very early was, as Yuka said, and I think Ramo also said, was traffic and mobility. Because most of people they were using port, which is in the historical part, to enter the city. So when the boat come, this is example where when the boat come, this is the main area to go out of the city. But when the boat come, nobody can pass in that area. Because for 1 hour now, you have traffic, you have a queue, and if you have, for example, very lucky, you want to go to the airport at that moment, you never be able to do that. So mobility was very, very important. But mobility starts also to create a challenge within the inside historical city, because the thinking was not clear. The thinking was division. So the mobility you can see in the left-hand side, big truck, which is inside the historical city, and you can see here in the right-hand side, this is the same street. So when the city grow, the city grow, the population grow, the income grow, people, they start to use another system of mobility. You can argue and say, why don't you use another kind of, public transport? That is, of course, is also a solution. But here I wanted to show that this kind of division, that historical city was not, thinking of managing the larger part of the town, was creating the larger part of the town, was creating now a problem to the historical city. So this is one of the streets of the historical city was quite impossible to walk. So what did we do? And then here you can see that the challenge we have, that we have historical city, stone town, we have a bus and number. So our idea was really to go out of this idea of, discontinuity between historical city, buffers and number. And then we say, let's create a new entity, what we call a new city center, that it will link. So that linkage will bring it again. As I told you, the process of conservation had an idea of cutting that linkage between historical city and urban ensemble, and then we bring it again. And then and this was part of the master plan which we have produced in 205 to say, look, we cannot isolate historical city. If you look in the right-hand map here, you can see one is a historical city, and the second one now is a city center, which used to be partly buffer zone and partly, and then the city become very large. So this system of creating linkage was very, very important to us. And how this is where this is coming, and I come again where Juga say, this was all approach of historical urban landscape, which was developed in with UNESCO 2011, and Zanzibar was among the very first historical city to try to apply this historical urban landscape. And the challenge for us was this connection between historical city and urban city. And then, of course, with this new understanding and the desire to use urban planning as a tool of management, we came to develop this new city center, which is now create a link. And then this big road, we call them green corridor, they really create a linking. And with this, we can now create new mobility system to allow fluidity of movement with people, commerce, and the transport. So this is how we thank you very much. This is how we solve it. This is just to show that urban planning is extremely important tool when it comes to management of historical city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed, for your very interesting presentation. You really explained to us how planning can be an effective tool to connect historic areas with the rest of the city. So we can look at the entire planning of city as a whole, mainstreaming heritage in it. So thank you very much. And now our next presenter, if you can stop sharing your screen, Mr. Mohammed, that would be great. So the next presenter for our webinar is Mr. S. Vishwanath, who in his presentation will speak about his initiatives for the revival of traditional water systems in Bangalore, India. So over to you.
Great. Yeah. So am I audible?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So I'd just like to talk a little specifically about how we are trying to integrate traditional livelihoods, which have been around for centuries, ecological sustainability with regard to water, and talk about the historicity from an artifact perspective in terms of the water systems that were evolved in my city, Bangalore, in South India. So just to give you a context of the city, which is in small letters, Bangalore, up on the ridge line, which is pretty unique for a 13 million population city, that it's far away from a river and it's actually sitting on a ridge line, which makes traditionally and historically the water system to be dependent on local lakes and local wells for some time, till modernity took us to a river. The city has a memory of famine and drought. In the year 1876 to 78, there was 3 years of drought, which meant that the local lakes which were providing water ran dry. And this caused tremendous distress and actually death. About 100,000 people died because of the famine and the food shortage because of water shortage. This caused the city fathers to think through, and they then put in place a scheme to get water from about 24 kilometers away from a reservoir which they built on a river. Now, this was one of the first cities in India and actually in South Asia to use steam engines in 1894 to pump water into the city itself. And in 1911, this was the first place to use electricity to pump water into the city of Bangalore. So there's a historicity with and a link to the water supply systems of Bangalore city. Also around the lake, there is this engineering design of something called a siphon, which was meant to take away excess water from the lake in the case of huge floods. And this is also a pretty unique engineering structure. A limited number of them were built, and they have pretty much good engineering and historic value. This is called a Ganesha Iyer siphon. It is like a volute siphon. But the traditional system in the city for about 1,000 years was what you see on the left, which is called a tank in our local parlance. It's a man-made lake or a human-made lake, which is built by throwing an earthen berm across a valley and holding on to the rainwater. Now that rainwater is held and it recharges the ground. And as the photograph on the right shows you, it emerges in these wells, which are beautifully constructed by a particular community. And I'll come to that. These wells had filtered water and with the drinking water sources. The lakes on the left were irrigation sources in the command area just below the lake, and the wells were the drinking water sources and domestic use sources. In traditional Indian language, in Kannada, in the local language called Kere Babi. This was the culture which dominated for about 1,200 years till we went to the river to go away. Now, we started a project as part of a small trust called Biome to start to map the historic wells of the city. And we found more than 10,000 wells. This is just a flavor of how the wells are, old wells, some of them as old as 500 years old in temples and in domestic houses, but they were pretty nicely distributed. And so when we looked at these wells as sources of water, we found that the old towns, the part of called Pottery Town, Cottonpate, Baswangudi, these are old towns of the city which have amalgamated themselves with a large metropolis, still continue to hold on to these wells as far as possible and depend on them, if not for potable water, for other domestic uses. And there was a particular cultural and personal affiliation with the wells, which are old structures. So we wanted to understand what's happening with aquifers, groundwater, and the wells and the city, and whether the groundwater and the aquifers can become reliable sources of holding on to rainwater and making sure that it's available during years of drought. The sustainability question which Aromar addressed. What we found was something fascinating. We found that there's a traditional community of well diggers called the Manvaddars, or the Ode community. Muniappa is here, Ramakrishna, Shankar are here. These people, this community has been digging wells and digging for lakes for more than 1,000 years, all across India, and especially in Bangalore. And that there were more than 750 families still continuing the tradition of going from home to home, desilting wells, deepening them, digging new ones, disinfecting them, and bringing them back to life. So we said, okay, can we try and get this particular community more livelihoods? Can we preserve and protect the old wells, which are artifacts? Can we dig new ones? And can we take this forward as a sustainability measure? So the conceptualization in the city of Bangalore is to dig 1 million wells. First, to protect the old ones, but then to dig a new recharge wells, which are 1 million in number, which will harvest rainwater and put it into the aquifer. And as this process of ecological sustainability goes on, this traditional livelihood, which is more than 1,000 years old, will be expanded, and more people from that community will have jobs, right? Will have livelihoods and employment. And so that's the process that is on, and about 140,000 wells have been dug, and about 10,000 old open wells have been cleaned, desilted, and brought back to life. Just for example, in the heart of the city is a place called Kabban Park, which is about 220 acres. And the well that you see on the top left is a place where the traditional religious festival of the city called the Karaga, which is being celebrated since over 500 to 550 years, does a pit stop. It stops there, the procession stops there, and there's some rituals which are done with water and a temple. And so this was one of the wells we were able to revive with the help of the Manvaddar community. And more such wells, as you see here, were revived and are now functional and utilitarian. They provide water. They're also old structures. Because they provide water, they're also respected and protected. And they're also sustainable because you can recharge them and make sure that you use the water which you recharge. Right? And so this has been the effort in Bangalore. And this is another community which has gathered together and protected the well and desilted it, removing 100 truckloads with the help of the Manvaddars. And this now gets stored with rainwater and stormwater and then provides water. So the overall endeavor has been to look at historicity and the old artifact of the well and to try and integrate it in the modern concept of rainwater harvesting and recharge. So as you see in these two wells, the rooftop water is coming from the pipes and is going into the well through a filtering process. And this is the new skill that the traditional well diggers have picked up and are then therefore expanding as part of their business and as part of their livelihood. This has been facilitated by an overall bylaw, building bylaw, and a policy for water conservation. So the wells themselves are not conserved or not protected in Bangalore, but at least what has been encouraged is for every building and every space to harvest rainwater. That's now mandatory, and every new building that comes up has to do that. So therefore, we're trying to integrate these lessons in water heritage and sustainability together with modern bylaws and policies. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vishwanath. Your presentation has provided us with yet another excellent example of on how urban heritage components such as traditional water systems can play such an important role in addressing contemporary urban issues such as that of water security. So last and but not the least, I'm very pleased to invite Professor Marcus Schroy to present his case of Banja Luka in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Over to you, Marcus.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see the slides. I'm a little bit unsure about this technological part from my side.
Not yet. I think you need to share your screen.
Okay, I'm very sorry. So it's good that I asked. Now you should be there.
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. The title of what I'm going to present is Public Intervention Connecting the City Parts. One example from Banja Luka. I think the title is a very good representation of one of the results, but as this started and the approach we used had different themes and challenges in mind, I think this could be a good start of discussing what integration or integrated really means. To give you a short, no, I hope this works. Yeah, I was too fast. Just to show you where we are in a country which is called Bosnia and Herzegovina. I made a red dot where the city of Banja Luka is located. It's actually the second largest city in Bosnia-Herzegovina and is the de facto capital and the largest city of the Republic of Srpska, which is one of the, I'm not sure if one politically correct can say counties of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It has roughly around 140,000 inhabitants. This actually is an overview of the city center. I will show you this red line will show you where is the main street where people go to shop, where they go on a Sunday walk to show off. South of this street, you can see a very important castle. We are soon going to talk about this castle, and it's bordered by a river even more to the south. More near, so now we come towards the actually place where we started with our intervention. You see the castle fortress, which is located there. It's actually medieval, but it has some foundations which go much further back than even before pre-Roman times. It's actually very good preserved, but as I told you in the title, this was not our primary goal of intervention. Also, I was once some years ago working for UNESCO. In that respect, here our idea was a completely different one. Where you see this circle right now, it's hidden behind the trees. It's actually a park. As you maybe, or the planners from you could see from before, on left from the circle, you have actually a very nice beach, which is on the sun, but it has no accessibility. And it has also very little users as a result of this. But as you can see on the down right corner of this presentation, this area, which is actually a little bit away from the central business district, is a traditional housing area from the former Yugoslavian Tito area. this park I was showing you, or this green space, was actually built or dig out as a contact point for the people to meet the river. But since it's an area which is a little bit off the center, so it's off the social control of the any other control, and it's also in a quite deprived area. This part was taken over by alcohol and drug consume in the form of humans doing this. Our idea or our question was, how could we give this area back to the people, always having on one side the historical parts of the city as connecting the area to the city center in mind, but also with the castle in that respect as a kind of background. This was not the only idea. The second idea was to how could we combine the actual change of an area with pedagogical task, and how could we, even without constructing in the first place, how could we regain this area for the local families? So we did some design tasks which we went out to the people with, but as it was more or less known already before, the people could not handle this quite abstract approaches very well. So our idea was that if we want to do something, we have to construct something at the area. We got some local financing. What reminds me this picture very good, soon to be talking about the construction and the intervening at the area. And the back of this picture, you see another culturally very important asset of this task. It's actually a Banja Lukan gondola. It's called Dayak. It's the traditional way of how you move up and down the river. No, of course, you could imagine moving up will give you a lot of muscles, and this made the owners of these dayaks very precious object in the female area, or in the female approaches there. This is why most of these boats have a lot of different names, mainly the names of the girlfriends of the boys. But this aside, you see the river in itself is also a quite important river. It's the main river in the north of Bosnia. It's going to the river Sava and then later on into the Danube. Coming back to you see these young students working there. So our approach was that if we intervene, we do two things at the same time. We create activity which people will see and try or start to interact with us, where we could also discuss eventual interventions with them, but also occupying some space which, as I said before, was used by people for alcohol, drug consume, and also dealers. This was actually a cooperation with a lot of different fields of expertise. So what nowadays is called this multi-layer approach, where also cultural heritage approach was very important asset. Still, as I said before, the main goal of the intervention was not the highlighting of any cultural asset, but as I also tried to say in the beginning, it was this integration or this integrating the integrative part which made it part of the whole process. So this approach also made it possible for people. No, you can see here, some of them are students, some are youngsters from the area, could engage in building and could also gain the ownership to this place. Now, in this second last picture of this very short intervention, which was done early in the morning, you could see an idyllic landscape, maybe a picturesque picture only, but the real result, and this I mean also the term integration would mean, I think, could be seen on this last picture. Whereas the whole area was neglected and deprived, and also had use which not allowed the use of everyone. It's these small examples like the basket of this basketball court, which was destroyed in over 20 years, which one night was repaired by a local guy, which actually highlights how important now, not only in developing the city, but also in developing and integrating the heritage, the cultural heritage, the living heritage, how important the local stakeholders are in this activity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Your presentation has really shown us how small-scale interventions in public spaces in the historic cities, such as the one you showed, can effectively connect historic city with its own people, which is really an essential part of a city's sustainability. Let me thank once again all the presenters for their stimulating presentations. You have brought forward many interesting perspectives and examples that clearly provide us with a way forward for ensuring the continuity and evolution of historic cities. Now, we have received many interesting questions and comments from our audience, and I can see that Aromar has been already responding to many of the questions that are posed to him specifically. I will now take up a few questions for Yuka. Since Yuka is with us, I'm going to invite him, and he will be responding to some of the questions that you have posed. So one of the questions, Yuka, please, if you can be here. So one of the questions that has come to you, in fact, I'll combine two questions for you, is that you have the changing urban scale, and the change is really a part of of cities. So how do we protect historic monuments in such a changing environment? And also, like, for adaptive reuse of heritage buildings or to adapt to new uses, what is the maximum kind of extent to which a structure can be changed? So over to you, Yuka, please come.
That is a good question. I would start by saying that the integrated conservation planning, which has been now promoted for the last half a century almost, from the 1960s and 70s onwards, it will have a requirement to, first of all, understand the context. So the context, which is the historic fabric which has been built in the territory, meeting the requirements of the community, is the starting point. In that particular territory, we need to understand what types of structures have been designed in order to meet those particular requirements. For example, it can be residential, it can be commercial, it can be industrial. And then when you are thinking about a change of function in a modern time, for example, then we will need to have, first of all, having understood the fabric, the context of their activity, I think it is good to remember what my professor of architecture said once in Helsinki. He said that the architect needs to think about three issues. One is the site. What is the site? What are the requirements of the site? And then you can think about the uses, the function that is proposed, the project, which is the client in some way. And you have to say, you have to verify that the proposed function is suitable for that particular type of context. And that then you have to also understand how to do that. And that is the task of the architect. So the architect has to be able to meet the requirements of the surrounding context with the proposed new function which is being proposed. So if you are introducing new buildings, it will be, of course, a major issue. And there are some successful examples and some not very successful examples. And therefore, it is necessary to have a good understanding of the typology of the buildings and spaces, and also about the morphology of the urban fabric, and we have to look at the historic city as a whole. Within a particular historic building or monument, the question of flexibility depends on the way this new function meets the requirements which are present with, let's say, the specific characteristics, typological characteristics that have been built over time in that building. So you have to see that the fundamental characteristics are not undermined, but that the new function is suitable for that particular building.
Thank you very much, Yuka. So Yuka's has responded to several questions that have been raised. So I will just pose one question which has come in for Aromar. Probably he has not responded because it has just come in. So Aromar, you mentioned a lot about the cities which are undergoing urbanization are under huge pressure. So there's a question about those small and medium-sized towns where actually people are migrating from them. I mean, they are not under pressure, but they are actually being depopulated, and they contain a lot of heritage. So what do you think about, or what are your suggestions about the sustainability of those settlements, which are probably getting depopulated and are still having a lot of values there? So maybe if you can talk a little bit about those small and medium-sized towns, Aro. Maybe he's not around. So anyways, I think we are running quite a bit behind our schedule. So I would just say that I will like to mention here that that ICCROM has recognized the importance of integrated management of historic cities way back in 1997, when Integrated Territorial Urban Conservation Program, ITUC, was initiated thanks to the efforts of Yuka, who is actually with us here today, and which was further carried on by Professor Herb Stovall. In the light of pressing global challenges, we will continue to work towards developing capacity and advocacies in this critical area for heritage and urban practitioners and organizations. Before concluding this webinar, on behalf of ICCROM team, I would like to once again express gratitude to all the panelists and also our organizing team here at ICCROM that has been working hard to bring these webinars to you since April. We also thank all the attendees for participating in this webinar, and you can actually find the recorded version of all the webinars, and including this webinar is going to be made available at our website. Please note that the recordings of the previous webinars can easily be accessed if you click on the ICCROM Lecture Series section of our website. Then I would also mention that we will be continuing to have more webinars on topics that are of interest for heritage and for society. And I will like to take this opportunity to announce that the next webinar will take place on 19th November, and maybe we can have the slide for the next webinar. This webinar is going to be in Spanish. The title will be Applied Conservation in Times of COVID. So in case you are interested, and you are more than welcome to attend this webinar, which will be on 19th of November at 4 p.m. So thank you very much once again. I think in this webinar, we had very exciting discussions, and this gives us a pointer that we need to continue working on how to look at protection of heritage values, but at the same time addressing the needs of continuity and change that are the inherent characteristics of our heritage, urban heritage. So thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Goodbye.